Hi, friends. Today I have a book called The Priest with Dirty Clothes, and this was written by R.C. Sproul and illustrated by Justin Gerard. R.C. Sproul was a Presbyterian minister and also a theologian, author, very, very intelligent man. And he wrote this book to try to help children understand a very difficult concept in Christianity. And that is about God's righteousness and Jesus's righteousness applied to us, even though we have done a lot of bad things, how Jesus is good in him covers us. And God sees Jesus's righteousness when he looks at us, when we believe in Jesus as our Savior. That's a very difficult concept and hard to understand. And it goes along with the Bible passage in Zechariah 3, verses 1 through 5. So if you want, before or after reading this story, if you want to look at those Bible verses, that's where R.C. Sproul got his inspiration for this book. This book was given to me by a friend, Andrea, so thank you. She actually went to church with R.C. Sproul and his lovely wife. So she gave me this book, and now I hope you enjoy it as much as I did when I heard it. Darby and Campbell McFarland live near a beautiful lake in Scotland called Loch Lomond. 7-year-old Darby was always finding a way to get herself and her little brother Campbell into trouble. One day after it had rained, they went outside to play. "Let's make mud pies," Darby said. The children pretended they were bakers. They found some mud and rolled it and patted it and fashioned it into pretend cakes and pies. As they played, they wiped their hands on their clothes, spreading mud all over themselves. They laughed and giggled, and they got muddier and muddier. When their mother saw them, she did not laugh. "Just look at you two. You look like you are mud pies yourself," she cried. "Hurry and take off those filthy clothes, and I'll give you both a bath." After the children were clean, their mother looked at the muddy clothes. "I'll never be able to get these dirty clothes clean," she said to herself. Just then, there was a knock at the front door. It was the children's grandfather. As Darby and Campbell rushed in to hug him, Grandpa grinned and said, "It looks like someone made a mud pie bakery in the front yard." The children giggled. "It seems that our little bakers have ruined their clothes," Mom said. "That's too bad," Grandpa said. "But it reminds me of a strange and wonderful story." Look at the dog. He got mud on him too, didn't he? "Oh, tell us, please," Darby begged, pulling Grandpa toward the sofa. And soon they were all seated. Grandpa began his story. Many years ago, in a faraway land, the people of a small village crowded into a large church. It was nighttime. The church was dark except for the candles that were lit inside, casting long shadows on the high walls. A young man named Jonathan was lying on the floor with his arms stretched out so that his body was in the shape of a cross. A great bishop prayed for him. This was the most important night of Jonathan's life. He was about to become a priest. At the end of the ceremony, the bishop gave Jonathan the special clothes of a priest. First, the bishop gave Jonathan a blue robe with a white hood and helped him put it on over his long brown robe made of scratchy wool. Then the bishop tied a white cord around Jonathan's waist. Now Jonathan was a priest. The very next week, Jonathan was invited to the castle of the king. He was to preach his first sermon to the royal household. Jonathan worked hard to prepare his sermon. He wanted it to be his very best. He's probably very nervous, right? Doing his first sermon and it's before the king. When it was time for Jonathan to go to the castle, it was raining very hard. Jonathan didn't want his new special clothes to get wet, but there was nothing he could do. He pulled the hood of his robe over his head and set out for the castle. As Jonathan and his horse made their way to the castle, the muddy road became more and more slippery. Suddenly, the horse slipped and stumbled, and Jonathan fell off. Jonathan was not hurt, but he was muddy from head to toe. There was mud on his face and on his shoes. There was mud all over his blue robe. The white cord was no longer white. Jonathan was very upset. Jonathan tried hard to clean himself off, but there was no way he could clean his clothes and get to the castle on time. He thought about running away. He didn't want to preach in front of the king in his such dirty clothes. The king just has to understand, he thought. So Jonathan kept going until he reached the castle. What could he do? When he arrived, Jonathan hurried into the castle. He looked for a place to clean himself, but the tower bells began to ring. It was time for the royal household to gather to hear Jonathan's sermon. Slowly, Jonathan walked to the place where he was to stand and opened his Bible. As soon as the people saw Jonathan's dirty clothes, they began whispering. The king also was surprised to see the priest's mud-covered clothes. But the king was a kind and gentle ruler, and he could see that Jonathan was ashamed of his appearance. He knew that Jonathan must have a good reason for coming to the palace in such dirty clothes. At that very moment, the court magician, whose name was Malice, stood up and shouted, "Wait! This priest cannot preach before the king wearing those dirty clothes." Malice was a very mean man. He hated all priests. He even hated priests whose clothes were clean. Because he was powerful and mean, the people were afraid of him. As soon as Malice shouted against Jonathan, other people began to yell mean things about Jonathan too. The king felt sorry for Jonathan. He didn't like the way Malice was behaving. He was afraid that Malice might cause someone to harm the priest. The king stood and said to the people, "Be calm, please. Stop talking. I will take care of this problem." The people grew silent. Even Malice stopped talking. The king then asked Jonathan to come forward. When Jonathan walked up to him, the king said, "Why did you come here in these dirty clothes?" Jonathan explained what had happened. The king nodded and said, "I understand. I am sorry that you had this accident. You cannot preach here today wearing such dirty clothes, but I will give you another chance. You may come back next week and preach, but only if you wear clean clothes." "Thank you, Your Majesty," Jonathan said. "I am sorry I am so dirty. I promise that next week I will be clean." Jonathan left the castle as fast as he could. When he got home, the first thing he did was try to clean his clothes. But the stains were so deep he couldn't get them out. The more he tried to clean his clothes, the worse they looked. They were so dirty, they looked like his old scratchy brown robe. The next day, Jonathan took his special clothes to the town fuller. The fuller was a man who cleaned people's dirty clothes. He had special soaps that could get mud out of all the clothing. The fuller looked at Jonathan's clothes and said, "These clothes are so dirty, I don't know if I can make them clean. But I will do my best, so come back tomorrow." When Jonathan returned to the fuller's shop, the fuller said, "I'm afraid that I cannot make your clothes clean. They are ruined forever. The only thing you can do is get new clothes." "But I can't get new clothes," Jonathan said. These clothes were given to me by the bishop. He only gives out one set of clothes. I'm sorry about that, the fuller said, but there is nothing more I can do. You could go see the bishop. Maybe he can give you a new set of clothes so you can preach before the king. Jonathan didn't think the bishop would give him a new set of clothes, but he had to ask. So he went straight to the bishop's office. The bishop patiently listened to Jonathan's story. Then he said, "This is a sad thing that has happened to you, Jonathan, but there's nothing I can do to help you." Jonathan was very sad. "Isn't there something I can do to get clean clothes?" he asked. "Please let me do something special to earn new clothes." The bishop's face was sad. "No, Jonathan," he said, "the rules are clear. There is nothing you can do on your own to earn a new set of clothes. The only person who can help you is the great prince. Perhaps you should speak to him." The bishop gave Jonathan the directions to the palace of the great prince. Jonathan carefully followed the directions until he came to the place where the great prince lived. He asked a guard for permission to see the prince, and the guard escorted Jonathan to the great hall where the prince was sitting on a throne. When Jonathan saw the prince, he was amazed. The prince was dressed in a long purple robe with precious jewels on it. There was a band around his waist made of pure gold. His face seemed like to shine like the sun. Jonathan had never seen anyone like him. The prince looked at Jonathan with caring eyes. "Why are you here?" he asked in a voice that was soft and kind. "What do you need from me?" Jonathan said, "Oh, great prince, I am a new priest. I am to preach a sermon to the king's household, but I have ruined my clothes, and I cannot stand in front of the king without clean clothes. No one has been able to make my clothes clean. Is there anything you can do to help me?" Jonathan told the prince how his clothes had become dirty. The prince listened quietly, then said to Jonathan, "I understand your problem, and I can help you." "Are you going to give me clean clothes?" Jonathan asked. "You will soon see, Jonathan," the prince replied. "But first, come with me to the fireplace." Jonathan followed the prince to the corner of the room where a small fire was burning in the fireplace. The prince pointed to a small branch at the edge of the fire. The branch had been partly burned, but it was no longer hot. The prince told Jonathan to pick up the branch. Jonathan reached down and picked up the branch. He held it and looked at it. It was black and charred. When the prince said Jonathan could put it down again, Jonathan put it back beside the fire. Then the prince said, "Now look at your hand." Jonathan looked down and saw that his hand was black. It was covered with soot from the branch. "Jonathan," the prince said, "you are like the branch you pulled from the fire. You are covered with dirt. But the dirt is not just on your clothes. It's on your heart. Sin, the wrong things you do, make your heart dirty. No soap can make it clean." Then the prince said, "Jonathan, I can help you. Go to the castle next week and be ready to preach your sermon. Wear your dirty clothes, and I will take care of them." Jonathan felt sad and afraid. "But great prince," he said, "the king said I could not stand in front of him in my dirty clothes, and the evil magician Malice will do something mean to me if I enter the castle with dirty clothes." A warm smile spread across the face of the great prince. "Yes, Jonathan, I know all about Malice and his meanness. I also know the king very well. You see, Jonathan, the king is my father." Jonathan asked, "How are you going to make my clothes clean?" The prince answered, "I promised you that I will take care of that. I never break my promises. I always do what I say I will do. Now go home and get ready for your sermon. I will be there and do what I promised." When the next week came, Jonathan was both excited and afraid. He thought about not going to the castle at all. Then he remembered the promise the prince had made to him. "I will trust in the promise of the prince. I will go to the castle," he said to himself. Jonathan went outside and got on his horse. This time, the day was bright with sunshine. There was no storm clouds in the sky. Jonathan had no trouble making the journey to the castle. When he got there, he could see a crowd of people going in. Jonathan swallowed hard and walked inside to the place where he was to stand and preach. But just as soon as Jonathan took his position, Malice stood up and shouted, "May bad things happen to you, O priest. You are still wearing dirty clothes." The king looked at Jonathan and frowned. "Why are you here again with dirty clothes?" the king asked. "I told you that you could not stand in front of me looking like that." Jonathan felt ashamed. His face turned red. He could not even answer the king. The people began to whisper. Some shouted loudly, "Go away!" At that moment, someone came in the room. It was a man dressed in a scratchy brown robe, exactly like the robe Jonathan wore under his special clothes. The man was carrying a present under his arm. At first, no one recognized the stranger. Then someone shouted, "It's the great prince!" Malice did not know what to think. He asked, "What is the meaning of this? Why are you here, and why are you wearing that itchy robe?" The prince did not answer. He was smiling as he walked to the front of the room and stood next to Jonathan. Then the prince handed Jonathan the present and told him to open it. Everyone watched Jonathan as he carefully opened the gift the prince had given to him. Jonathan's eyes grew wide when he saw what it was. It was the perfect present. Inside were the beautiful clothes that belonged to the prince. The prince smiled again at Jonathan and said, "These are the clean clothes I promised you. They are yours forever. They will never wear out. There's not a spot of dirt on them, and nothing can make them dirty. They are perfect for you." I don't remember if I showed you that picture or not. Then the prince said to Jonathan, "Take off your dirty clothes and give them to me." Jonathan took off his dirty clothes and gave them to the prince, and the prince put them on himself. "Next," the prince said, "put on my clothes and preach your sermon." Jonathan's hands shook as he put on the prince's beautiful clothes. When Jonathan was dressed, the prince said to the king, "Father, may Jonathan now stand in your presence? He is one of my people." The king was pleased. He said to the prince, "Yes, my son, as long as he wears your clothes, he may stand in front of me." Jonathan was filled with joy. "How can I ever thank you for being so kind to me?" he asked the prince. The prince said, "If you are really thankful, and if you want to show that you love me, then keep all the commandments that I give to you." "Oh, I will," Jonathan said. "I want to be good enough to wear your clothes." "But you cannot be good enough, Jonathan. You must live your whole life trusting in my goodness while you wear my clothes." On that day, Jonathan preached his best sermon ever, and he spent the rest of his life preaching about the great prince. He wore the prince's perfect present until the day he died. Grandpa turned to Darby and Campbell and said, "That is the end of my story. Did you like it?" "Oh, yes," the children replied. "Do you think that if we could find the great prince, that he would give us clean clothes too?" "Yes," Grandpa answered. "He gives clean clothes to everyone who believes in him, but they are not clothes like the ones you ruined today. the great Prince gives new clothes for our hearts. The dirt we get on our clothes can sometimes be washed away, but we have a bigger problem. When we sin and do wrong, our hearts become so dirty that we cannot stand in front of God. For us to be able to be friends with God, we need to have the dirt on our hearts cleaned away. This is what Jesus does for us. He forgives us by taking the dirt from our hearts and putting it on himself, just like the great Prince took Jonathan's dirty clothes and wore them. So when God looks at us, he doesn't see the dirt on our hearts. Instead, he sees a heart covered by his son's clean clothes. If you trust in Jesus and believe his word, your heart will be clean. Jesus will forgive you when you sin, but you have to ask him to forgive you. Then he cleans your heart and you can stand in front of God forever. I'm sorry we got mud on our clothes, but I'm sure glad we heard the story about the great Prince, Darby said. With a hug, her mother said, yes, it is a story we all need to hear and remember. And it is, and I am so glad that God cleaned my heart and I can stand before God someday. So I hope you enjoyed The Prince with Dirty Clothes. And if you are interested, I'm not going to read them, but I'm going to put them up on the screen if there's discussion questions you want to go through. It says for the parents. It's hard for me to see if it's all seen there, so you can just pause if you want to look at those. There's more. But wait, there's more. And more. Or you could discuss this for weeks, couldn't you? Actually, a lifetime. Have a good day.